Anybody know what this place is right here? See this picture? What is that? Anybody know? It's Paris. It's the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Doesn't look like the normal perspective of Paris, does it? What's this place, Terry? New York City. A little different than you experience it when you're walking around up close, right? How about this? What's this? Statue of Liberty. I had no idea that the base was basically all these triangles on there. Anyway, the point is, sometimes when you look at something from above and a long ways away, you get a different perspective. And so that's what we're trying to do on these Wednesday nights with the Old Testament is draw back, get high altitude, and get a different perspective and maybe catch some details or some truths that you miss when you're so focused on word for word for word. Okay? So that's why we're doing this. And let me just bring you up to speed where we are going to jump into the story tonight. We've looked at so far 4 really important things up to this point that we have to keep our eyes on are the 4 covenants that God has cut with some people. And the first one was with Adam. The next covenant was with a man named Noah. And then the big covenant in the Old Testament is the one with Abraham, where God moves Abraham from his land and says, I'm going to bless the whole world through you. All generations will be blessed through you. It's the big, big covenant. And then God makes a covenant with Moses, and we looked at that last week. Actually, last week we looked at the book of Judges. That's the next slide. Last week we looked at judges who are not like gavel and black robe in a courtroom, but they're like leaders of a community. And we looked at this 350-year cycle of sin and rebellion and repentance and deliverance and sin and rebellion and 350 years. They didn't have a king, they didn't have a leader, but they had these judges, and God just kind of let them be, let them do their own thing. Well, tonight, we get to the end of the period of Judges, and if you have your analog Bible, Eric's just looks like a purse, but that's pretty cool. If you have your analog Bible, we're going to cover the history from 1 Samuel all the way through 2 Chronicles. And it's 4 little books. It actually used to be, it's 6 books, but it actually used to be 3 books until about 70 BC, and then they split them. And so for us, it's 6 different books. But it's a big period of history that we have to look at because this is where we see kind of the rise and the fall of the kingdoms that God establishes of his people. Up to this point, the people we've been talking about are referred to in the Bible and in history and by foreign nations as Hebrews. They are the Hebrew people. Once they settle into the land, once they take over the land that God has given them, now they are the nation of Israel. So they're Israelites. So far throughout history, and you can back this up with all of the nations around them in history have recorded the Hebrew people, then the Israelite people. And tonight we're going to meet the Jews for the first time. We'll tell you how we get there. That's why we still call them the Jews. So the beginning of the end. We're going to start in 1 Samuel, and we kind of get the story about this lady who had a child, and then the child was given over to the priesthood. And God visits this child and says, Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. And God calls this young man, his name is Samuel, to be a prophet. But he kind of has an overlapping job. He's also the last judge. So he's the last judge in the cycle of sin and rebellion and oppression and then repentance and deliverance. He's the last judge. He's the last leader. But he's also the first prophet that the nation has, the first one that God calls to speak for him to the people of Israel. And just right off the bat, we're going to see that Israel demands a king. Let's look at it. It's 1 Samuel chapter 8. As Samuel grew old, so the first 7 chapters are kind of the calling of Samuel and some of the stuff he does as a young man. And then we get to the end of his life in chapter 8. As he grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel, and they were Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons. They held court in a place called Beersheba, but they were not like their father. They were greedy for money. They accepted bribes and perverted justice. So finally, all the elders of the people of Israel met at a place called Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. They said, look, you're old and your sons aren't like you. So give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. So important. Give us a king like all the other nations have. Samuel was displeased with their request. I don't know if he was displeased because they were calling him old, or if they were saying, your kids are losers and we don't want any part of them, or if he was upset because they were demanding a king. But listen to what he says. So Samuel was displeased with their request, and he went to the Lord for guidance. There's a good idea. When you're upset, go to the Lord for guidance. Do everything they say to you, the Lord replied to Samuel. For they are rejecting me, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. In Deuteronomy, God set up all these rules in this covenant, and he was to be their king. They were to be different than everybody else. They were to be a theocracy. They were to be ruled by God. They wouldn't need a man to rule them. They would have the eternal creator God as their king, and he's saying they don't want that anymore. Ever since I brought them out from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me and followed other gods, and now they are giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. This is a brand new thing for them. They've been a nation for 400 years. So Samuel passed on the Lord's warning to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is how a king is going to reign over you. The king will draft your sons and assign them to his chariots and his charioteers, making them run before his chariots. Some will be generals and captains in his army. Some will be forced to plow in the fields and harvest his crops. Some will make his weapons and chariot equipment. The king will take your daughters from you and force them to cook and bake and make perfumes for him. He will take away the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his own officials. He will take a tenth of your grain and your grape harvest and distribute it among his officers and attendants. He will take your male and female slaves and demand the finest of your cattle and donkeys for his own use. He will demand a tenth of your flocks, and you will be his slaves. This is a stern warning, right? They should be paying attention. And you will be his slaves. And when that day comes, you will beg for relief from this king you are demanding. But then the Lord will not help you. What a tragic statement. The Lord is not going to help you when you ask. But the people refused to listen to Samuel's warning and said, even so, we still want a king. Even so, we still want a king. Here's their reasoning. This is their only explanation. We want to be like the nations around us. If you remember the last 2 weeks, God specifically gave instructions, destroy the nations around you because they are evil. The things they are doing, they're evil. And we've talked about this before in sessions past, that one of the things the nations around them did was routine child sacrifice. And it's a problem for God. And here are these nations, or here are God's people surrounded by people they were supposed to have eliminated. And they say, now we would like to just cast off our blessing, and we would like to not be different anymore. We don't want to be special anymore. We want to be just like everybody else. We want to be just like the nations around us. Our king will judge us and lead us into battle. And up until this point, every battle that they had fought, God had done something miraculous to win the battle for them. A king didn't have that ability. This is what they wanted. So I would like for you to take a couple minutes and don't give the obvious church answers. I want you to dig deep on your table talk. Here you go. Why do you think Israel wanted a king like all the other nations? And why do you think God granted their request? What was the motivation? Why would a nation want to do what they did? And then why do you think God said yes? Okay, I'm coming back here to Brett. We're going to start with you. You always have a good answer. You like it? Yeah. Why do you suppose these Israelites wanted a king like all the other nations?
Because they wanted a visual, like a physical representation of a king instead of, God the Father.
They wanted something like tangible, like they
tangible.
could touch and see and feel.
Yeah.
Why would that be important to them?
Well, we walk by faith and not by sight, but I think they wanted to visually, fulfill their senses and something they could see and touch and feel. And then, I feel like that was part of the reason why they visually wanted to have a king or, somebody to rule over them.
Really interesting
But
perspective.
then, for God bringing them back was hardship and suffering they had to face to see that, God is real and God was their greatest king they could ever have. had to make sacrifices, like leading up to, of course, what Jesus did for us.
That's really good.
My thoughts exactly.
Do y'all have an answer for that first question? Do y'all have an answer? No. Go ahead. And Lori, you got voted. You got voted and pass it to Eric. Sorry, that's my fault.
You have to be smarter than the equipment. We just talked about that. A lot of time had gone by, the ups and downs and stuff. And this generation had seen Samuel give power to his boys who were not good people. And so their faith in him may have slackened, even though he was old and everything else. And so that they'd gone far enough away from the miracles that they forgot those, put them kind of in the back. And so they wanted something more tangible, just like they said, that they could, in some ways, someone to blame when things
Interesting.
go wrong, someone to,
Hard to blame God, huh?
yeah, it's kind of tough.
That's a really interesting perspective. Huh. So why do you think, let's start here. Why do you guys think God said yes to that? Why would God allow that? They're all pointing at you.
We kind of, that a lot of times with our children, they have to learn to suffer the consequences of their actions for them to learn anything. You don't realize what you have until you lose it.
Yeah. Eric? She nailed it? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, just push me. We'll come back to that some more on this side of the table later. Do either of those two things, go back, Terry, if you don't mind. Do either of those two things just bother you? Like, does it just bother you when you hear Israel, the leaders of Israel saying, no, we want to be just like everyone else? Does that just kind of bother you a little bit? But isn't that what we want? That's kind of like tapping into our human nature, I think. Nobody wants to stand out. Nobody wants to be thought of as a weirdo or different. And here's this national identity, and they're embracing that. And then the last part of that second question should scare us a little bit, shouldn't it? That sometimes God gives you exactly what you ask for. Even if he warned them, here's some really bad things that are going to happen. Are you sure you're willing to endure this? Oh yeah, bring it on. Okay. And I think, Lord, you make a good point. If you've ever raised a kid, that's part of it, isn't it? Like sometimes you just have to say, all right, kid, you don't want to listen to me? Good luck. Let's see how that turns out for you. I'm here when you need me, but it ain't going to turn out good for you. Y'all been there? It's not easy. So here we see God being a good father, right? We see God allowing his children to fall. We're going to see him pick them up later. So let's get to the united monarchy. They asked for a king. And so Samuel finds a guy named Saul. You can read about it in 1 Samuel 9 through 15. Super important is that Saul is chosen because he's tall and handsome. Read it. Saul is chosen because his outward appearance looks like a king. He's like taller than everybody else. He's good looking. He's rugged. He's strong. He just looks like a king. Let's make him king. And that's what they did. So here's the first king. His name is Saul, chosen for his appearance. He's rejected by God for his disobedience. And what we need to learn from Saul is that partial obedience equals full rebellion. If you've raised a kid, you know that to be true, right? Just because you obeyed half of what I said doesn't mean you obeyed, right? So Saul, he takes on the duties of a priest and he's not supposed to. And he does some things that a priest was only allowed to do, but Saul says, no, the priest wasn't here and I wanted to make sure we had it done, so I did it. And God said, well, you're not allowed to do that. Even though you thought you were doing the right thing, you weren't allowed to do that. So he has this partial obedience. And not long into his rule, God rejects him as king, but then leaves him in the position of king, which is really strange. It's strange that God would say, I'm rejecting you as my king, but I'm leaving you there to continue to reign and rule. I think for several reasons. One, what you guys have said, that these people needed to experience a bad king and they needed to see what it looked like. And two, because the new king wasn't ready yet. We talked about that all Sunday morning, that David had to go through a season of preparation and struggling and learning how to be a ruler, how to be a leader. So one of the lessons you need to learn from Saul is that pride always breaks what God builds. This is the lesson of Saul's life. He was a prideful man, and God was trying to build these people, but the pride of Saul broke the nation. It just set them back so far. 1 Samuel chapter 31, the Philistines, they were always at war. For the 40 years of Saul's reign, 32 of them were spent fighting the Philistines. They closed in on Saul and his sons. They killed 3 of his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew very fierce around Saul. The Philistine archers caught up with him and wounded him severely. Saul groaned to his armor bearer, "Take your sword and kill me before these pagans Philistines come and run me through and taunt me and torture me." But his armor bearer was afraid and would not do it. So Saul took his own life. He took his own sword and fell on it. And that's the end of Saul. Not much later, in fact, just a few days or weeks later, we meet the second king of the united monarchy, and that's David. 1 Samuel 16 through 2 Samuel. We've met David in the story of Saul because David was anointed as king as a young man, 13, 14 years old. And then for the next 15 years, watched the decline of Saul and served Saul and even fought in the army. And then David had to run from Saul because Saul was trying to kill him. But David was not chosen for his appearance. He was the one actually chosen by God. So Saul, the first king, was chosen by the people, but David, the next king, was chosen by God. And he was the most unlikely of people to have been chosen. He was the youngest of his family. His family was not really that special in the tribe, and he was a teenager. So he's chosen by God. He's anointed in obscurity. The only people that knew he was going to be king were his brothers and his father. He had to keep it secret for a while. He spends 15 years of preparing before he's actually appointed the king. And then we find out that this guy, David, is very, very faithful, but he's very, very flawed. And one of my favorite things about the Bible is that the heroes of the faith don't get spared their bad stories. We see all of it. We see their sin. We see their failure. We also see their victories and their good qualities. But the Bible doesn't hide the failures of the men of faith. And so David he was gripped by lust and ruined his family by adultery, and then was a murderer, and then he had 6 wives and had this rebellious kid. He was just a flawed person. And yet, twice it tells us that he was a man. God called him. God himself called David, "That's a man after my own heart." And the fact that a murdering, adultering, lust-filled, flawed human being could also be somebody that's a man after God's own heart should be encouraging to all of us. That despite our flaws and despite our failures, God still looks at us and he wants us to chase after him. He doesn't overlook our flaws and failures, but he pays for them and covers them. And then we see, this is super important, God cuts a covenant with David. So we've had 4 covenants up to this point, and now we get to the 5th. 2 Samuel chapter 7. "Now go and say to my servant David, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared." He's talking to David. "I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people, Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth. And I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time I appointed judges to rule my people of Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, not a physical house, but a lineage, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He's the one who will build a house, a temple for my name. And I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with a rod like any father would do. But my favor will not be taken from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever." So God is cutting an eternal covenant with David, and it's called the Davidic covenant, and it's the last of the 5 Old Testament covenants. This is super important that we kind of get a big picture of this. There are 5 big covenants in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is God establishing this people, and the way he establishes them is he gives them the law, right? We looked at this. The first 5 books are basically God teaching his people how to be a people, and here's the rules. And when we, from our vantage point, look back on the Old Testament, we kind of see God as a rule giver. We kind of see the Old Testament as God, make sure you check all the boxes and then God's happy. But the reason that we see 5 covenants is significant. When you take the Hebrew language and you take the letters, each letter is also a number, and each number has a significance. The number 5 is the number, does anybody know what it's for? What it always stands for in Hebrew? The number 5 in the Hebrew language always refers to grace. It's interesting to me that God didn't cut 4 covenants. He didn't cut 6 covenants, he cut 5. In the middle of teaching his people how to be a nation by giving them law, he is, if you take a big view, he is also showing them all of this law is pointing to grace, which is what we see in the New Testament. And so even all the way back in Genesis and Exodus, we see God setting the foundation, laying out the framework for a grace that would take over all of the law, that would cover all of the law. And we see it. They would have known that these 5 also represented grace because 5 always represented grace. So super important that you hold on to that truth. The other parts of the covenant are that David's kingdom would be perpetual. It would never end. Now, does Israel have a king today? Do they have a king on a throne in Israel today? They do not have a king. So is God's covenant broken? No? Where's the king? They have a king. They just don't know it. It's Jesus. It's an eternal kingdom, which he promised, and the Messiah would come from the kingdom. The Messiah would come from the line of kings that David would establish. So there is a king of Israel. They just don't serve him, just like they didn't serve God the whole time in their history. There is a king that was born of the line of David, and he's coming back, and he will be their king. We talked about this in our Revelation class. He will be their king, but he is the king. So that line of perpetual kings has not stopped. There is an eternal king, and his name is Jesus. The united monarchy started with Saul, goes to David, and then David's son Solomon takes over. 1 Kings chapter 1. And in Solomon's reign, we see the golden age of Israel. In fact, we know from history that Israel at the time of Solomon's reign they were more wealthy, more powerful, more famous, more renowned than any of the nations around them. I mean, more so than Greece, more so than the Philistines, even stronger than the Assyrian Empire, which was coming next. They were super powerful. They were wealthy beyond imagination. And rulers from all over the world came to visit Solomon because of his great wisdom, but also because of his great wealth. Solomon builds this magnificent temple in Jerusalem that stood for 451 years. He builds this ridiculous palace, and he got in trouble for building the palace because it was bigger than the temple. He had so many horses and so much wealth and so many possessions that he actually was violating the law that was given in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, God was preparing these people. God knew they were going to ask for a king, and so he put down rules in Deuteronomy that the king was not supposed to do some things, was not supposed to have an abundance of horses, was not supposed to have an abundance of possession, and was not supposed to have an abundance of wealth. And Solomon did all of that. You know what else he did? He wrote one more rule. A king is not supposed to have an abundance of wives. And his compromised values literally split the nation. 1 Kings chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, so that's the first one we're kind of keen to, which was a problem, that they're sworn enemies. The Pharaoh is the emperor, the king of Egypt, that held his ancestors as slaves for 400 years, and now he's married into the family. He married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites, all the nations that were surrounding them. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, you must not marry them, the gods of the other nations, because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Ladies, y'all have a powerful influence over your men. You need to know that. It's important that you recognize that. He had 700 wives of royal birth. Now, we don't know if that was literal or if this is like, he had 1,000 camels and he had a bunch. Or maybe he literally had 700 wives. And 300 concubines. He had some love to give. He had 1,000 women in his life that he was responsible for and to. And in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. This Solomon started out his reign fully dependent on God, looking to God for everything, worshiping God, leading his people down the right path. And as soon as he started marrying women outside of his tribes, outside of God's blessing, he started to turn away from God. And in Solomon's old age, we're told, they turned his heart to not just away from God, but to worship other gods, instead of being completely faithful to the Lord, his God, as his father David had been. Check this out. Solomon worshiped Asherah. Now, part of the worship of Asherah was temple prostitution, which is probably why he had 300 concubines. It's just part of his fertility clinic, not a fertility clinic, a fertility cult. Man, you can't get your words mixed up there. Fertility cult. And so temple prostitutes were part of that. But listen to this. The goddess of the Sidonians and Molech. Now, to worship Molech, you had to sacrifice children. That was the only way to worship Molech. So Solomon was a child sacrificer at the end of his life. The detestable, God calls him the detestable God of the Ammonites. In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight. Get used to that phrase because we're going to hear it a lot. He refused to follow the Lord completely as his father David had done. Isn't that a sad turn of events that this man who started out so strong and built the nation into its, peak form completely turned his back on God, and not just turned and walked away from God, but worshiped the most detestable things possible. Man, talk about finishing weak. Talk about losing it in your old age. I don't want to be like that. I want to finish strong. I want to finish like David, not like Solomon. So we get to the end of Solomon's reign, and his pride, his moral failures, his worship of other gods literally splits the nation in two because he has two sons and they both want to be king and they both can't be king. So you know what they do? Well, let's just split the nation in half. They actually split it in 1/3 and 2/3. So we get to a period called the divided kingdom. In 931 BC, Solomon dies and his two sons, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, take over. And one of the sons takes the northern kingdom and it keeps the name Israel. And there's 10 tribes up there. And then the other son takes the lower kingdom of Judah and Benjamin, and that's the southern kingdom. Here's a map in case you want to see what we're talking about. Blue is north, yellow is south. And all the nations around them that Solomon had married into. By the way, everything on that map is supposed to be the kingdom of Israel, even further north. But they failed to obey God's instructions. They failed to root out all the people. If they had obeyed God, their land would have extended all the way north to the Euphrates River and all the way south down to the Negev. But this is what they're left with at this point. So let's look at the northern tribe. They're called Israel. Super important for later, especially when we get to the New Testament, is that its capital is not Jerusalem, it's Samaria. And when you get to the New Testament, the people of Judah, they're called Israel again, but those people, they hate the Samaritans, the direct ancestors of these people. And we'll talk about that in a few weeks. Of all the kings of the northern kingdom, not one was righteous. In fact, of all of them, God says, that man did evil in my sight. Every king of the northern tribe, there was 19 of them, over 210 years, not one of them followed God. They were all evil in the sight of God. There's all of their names, just in case you're curious. You've probably never heard of any of them but Ahab. Everybody kind of knows the story of Ahab and Jezebel. But there's a whole bunch of them there. Not one of them honored God. They all knew the scriptures. Did you know that as a king of Israel, you were required, according to Deuteronomy, when you became king, to write for yourself a perfect copy of the law of Moses. So every king was supposed to have in his possession his own handwritten copy of the law of Moses. And here's all these kings, how many? 19, who had the word of God, but it made no impact on their lives whatsoever. And they all did evil in the eyes of the Lord. But God, who is faithful and loves his people, he always sent them prophets. So if you look in the Old Testament, there's some prophets that are going to be familiar to you. Some of them are in the Chronicles, but some of them have their own little books. So when God sends his prophets to the northern kingdom, he sends Elijah and Elisha, who are pretty famous for their ministries. Read the book of Obadiah. That's to the northern kingdom of Israel. Joel is to the northern kingdom of Israel. Jonah is from the northern king of Israel, but he was a prophet to the people of, anybody know? Nineveh, whole different nation. But he's from this time period, and he's from the northern kingdom. And then the book of Amos and the book of Hosea. When you read those in the Old Testament, those are just for the northern kingdom. Those men sent by God to speak for God, to draw those people back to the truth, to the word, to his ways. The northern kingdom is completely and utterly destroyed in 722 BC by an up-and-coming empire that was undefeated in conquering every city they ever tried to conquer, the Assyrian Empire. If you don't know anything about the Assyrian Empire, you should read a little history on them. They were brutal. They were vicious, powerful, brutal people. Crucifixion was invented by the Assyrians. They were nasty, nasty people, and they were literally undefeated. They took over almost the whole Fertile Crescent. It was unheard of. They were super powerful. They came in and just wiped out the northern kingdom. And this is kind of, if you've ever heard of the quote, 10 lost tribes of Israel, this is where this comes from. They're not lost. They're just destroyed. And there's still some descendants, obviously. But this is, their kingdom no longer exists. Now the northern kingdom, the blue part on the map, is part of the Assyrian Empire. So the northern kingdom disappears, and now it's Assyria. And now the southern kingdom of Judah has a border with the world's nastiest empire, hell-bent on destroying everyone in their path, the Assyrians. So let's talk about the southern kingdom. They're called Judah. They have a mix of some good and some bad kings. And because David was from the tribe of Judah and the eternal covenant was through David, their destruction lasted, their imminent destruction was pushed further back. They lasted about 350 years instead of the northern kingdom, which lasted, I think I said, 200 years. So they had a little more staying power just because the covenant went through their line, but they were eventually destroyed too. So I think I have a list of all the kings. Yeah, there they are. And they had 8 good kings: Asa, Jehoshaphat. Let's see. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, Hezekiah, and Josiah. Important one to know is Hezekiah. So the reason Hezekiah is important to know is because he was king of Judah at the time the Assyrians were destroying the northern kingdom of Israel. And Hezekiah led this religious reform where he burned down all the high places and he took away all the idols and he just shredded them, and he called the people back to God and they worshiped God. And right about that time, the Assyrian army decided, well, let's take them. They're next. So they marched to Jerusalem. And this, you can see this in the Bible and in other historical sources. The Assyrian Empire talks about this too, the records of the Assyrians. So Hezekiah is the king of Jerusalem, the king of Judah, and the Assyrians are attacking. And before they get there, at this time, the water source for Jerusalem was outside the city walls. So all the invading army had to do was just kind of camp out around the well, and then the people inside the city couldn't have water. Super easy to take them over. So Hezekiah gets this brilliant idea. He says, we're going to dig an underground trench from the well underneath the wall into the city. So he sends out workers, one to the place where the water's going to end up and one to the place where the water's going to start. He didn't have no laser surveyor. He didn't have no LiDAR. He didn't have, a cat excavator. He had dudes with pickaxes. And they were several hundred feet away from each other, starting on both ends. And somehow they dug a tunnel underneath the ground and they ended up meeting together. And that moment is recorded for us in the scripture. It talks about how when the workers found each other and they chiseled a hole in the wall, and you can go today and walk through that tunnel. And on the wall, the workers inscribed what they had done. That we dug this under King Hezekiah's reign so that the Assyrians couldn't come in and take our water source. He literally, in this moment, just saved the nation of Judah because of his wisdom and because they had turned back to God. This miraculous underground working of digging a tunnel, it saved them for the next several hundred years. You have all these kings that come after him. You have Josiah, who was the last good king, killed by an Egyptian, and then Jehoahaz and Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin, and then Zedekiah. And all this time, God is sending prophets to them. During the reigns of the good kings, there were prophets, and during the reign of the bad kings, there were prophets. So when you're reading the Old Testament and you read Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk, you're reading God's prophets to the southern kingdom, the people of Judah, okay? In 586 BC, Judah is destroyed. By the way, Hezekiah, that whole incident in Hezekiah when the Assyrian army tries to take Jerusalem, but the tunnel gets dug, that's Assyria's first loss as a nation. That's the first time their army doesn't take a city. And it starts for the Assyrian Empire a decline. The Assyrian Empire starts to decline and the Babylonian Empire takes them over. But then in 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire marches into Judah, destroys it, and 2 Chronicles records for us exactly what happens. 2 Chronicles 36 says, the Lord, the God of their ancestors, repeatedly sent his prophets to warn them. I gave you the list of the prophets. For he had compassion on his people and his temple, but the people mocked these messengers of God and despised their words. They scoffed at the prophets until the Lord's anger could no longer be restrained and nothing could be done. So the Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Lord brought the king of Babylon against them. The Babylonians killed Judah's young men, even chasing after them into the temple. They had no pity on the people, killing both young men and young women. The old and the infirm. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. The king took home to Babylon all the articles, large and small, used in the temple of God, and the treasures from both the Lord's temple and from the palace of the king and his officials. So he just looted everything. Then his army burned the temple of God, which Solomon had built 450 years earlier, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all the palaces, and completely destroyed everything of value. Just utter destruction of God's people. The few who survived were taken as exiles to Babylon. They became servants to the king and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. So the message of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. The land finally enjoyed its Sabbath rest, lying desolate until the 70 years were fulfilled, just as the prophet had said. So Jeremiah had warned these people that this was coming, and they didn't listen. And they weren't following God's instructions for Sabbath rest. That every 7 years you don't land, you just let it, you just live off of last year's, you let the land rest. And now God said, oh, you don't want to follow my rules, I'm going to make you at this point. Now the land has rest, the people are gone, and that part of the story ends. And from this moment on, the nation of Israel is forever changed. They are polytheistic, they are paganist, they worship any god that suits their fancy up till this point, and then God takes them into exile. The story ends in exile, but it ends with expectation that something is about to happen. And so that's what we're going to look at next week. This time in exile, the 70 years that they spent living in Babylon, completely changed them forever. We're going to see that next week.